A judge in a small Nevada courthouse looks at the woman crying in front of him. She is wearing tinted goggles, a plain wool coat, a hat designed to draw no attention at all. He does not recognize her. He has no idea that the trembling woman giving testimony under the name Gladys Marie Moore is, in fact, Mary Pickford, the most famous woman alive in 1920, more recognizable at that moment than any president, any queen, any film star who came before or after her. She tells him her husband abandoned her. She tells him he was brutal. She tells him, between sobs, that he was an alcoholic. Every word of that is true. It is also, legally, only half the story, because Mary Pickford had not come to Minden, Nevada to start a new life, despite what she swore on the record. She had come to end an old one, a marriage to actor Owen Moore that had quietly devastated her for 9 years, while the public watched her play sweet, wholesome heroines on movie screens across the country. This is the story of that marriage. The drinking, the violence the world never saw, the disguise she put on just to be allowed, finally, to say the truth out loud in a room with legal power. And it is the story of what came afterward, because the isolation that defined Mary Pickford's final decades did not begin the night she escaped Owen Moore. It began there, in that pattern of silence and self-protection, and it would close in around her completely before her life was over. She was called America's sweetheart. Few people ever learned what that title cost her. Before we go further, if you're drawn to stories of women who carried the truth in silence for years before the world was finally ready to hear it, this is exactly the kind of history we dig into at Old Money Scandals. So stay with us, because what happened to Mary Pickford gets harder to watch the further it goes. Long before there was a witness stand in Nevada, there was a 5-year-old girl in Toronto, listening to her mother scream. Mary Pickford was born Gladys Louise Smith, into a household already shaped by alcoholism. Her father, an alcoholic, died in 1898 from a fatal blood clot after a workplace accident. He worked as a purser on a steamship, and the accident that led to his death happened on the job. Gladys was 5 years old. The sound of her mother's grief in that moment was something she carried with her for the rest of her life, so vividly that, by her own account, it disrupted her ability even to learn to read as a small child. There was no recovery period, no childhood to retreat into. By age 7, Gladys was already working, acting on stage to support her mother and 2 younger siblings, Lottie and Jack. The family lived for a time in a poor district of Toronto known locally as the Ward, where disease was common and money was not. That is the foundation this story is built on. A child who learned, before she had learned almost anything else, that her job was to provide, to perform, to be useful, and never to be a burden. By the time she was a teenager working in the earliest days of American film, under contract, earning wages that supported her entire family, she had functionally never been allowed to be young. So when a charming, dark-haired actor named Owen Moore, 4 years older, already established, full of attention she had rarely been given just for being herself, started paying notice to her, it is not difficult to understand why it felt like something she had been missing her whole life. They married secretly in January of 1911, in New Jersey. She testified years later that she had been 17. Her mother did not approve. The studio had no idea. For a brief window, it was simply a secret 2 young people shared, the kind of secret that feels romantic, before it starts to feel like something else entirely. It did not stay romantic for long. By the time the marriage began, Pickford was already a recognizable face in the new medium of motion pictures, working under directors like D.W. Griffith, building the screen persona that would eventually make her the most famous woman in the world. The wide-eyed, curl-haired ingenue audiences would come to know as Little Mary. Owen Moore, by contrast, was a working actor with a respectable but unremarkable career, the kind of steady secondary stardom that looked impressive next to an ordinary person and increasingly small next to his own wife. That imbalance did not announce itself on the wedding day. It built slowly, picture by picture, contract by contract, as Pickford's name moved from supporting credit to top billing, and Owen Moore's did not move at all. Here is the part of the story the public was never permitted to see. Almost as soon as the marriage began, the 2 of them were moving in opposite directions. Pickford's career accelerated at a pace almost nobody in the new medium of film had ever experienced. Owen Moore's, by contrast, stalled and then began to slip. According to multiple biographical accounts, including research compiled around the centennial of their divorce. This imbalance affected Owen deeply. His drinking, already a habit, intensified, and according to historical accounts of the marriage, the alcohol became tied directly to violent behavior that turned repeatedly into Owen more physically abusing his wife. There is no surviving transcript of those individual incidents. They happened in private, in hotel rooms during location shoots, in rented houses, behind doors that the publicity machine of early Hollywood made sure stayed firmly closed. What survives instead is the pattern, reconstructed later by biographers and by people who were close to the couple at the time. Separation, reconciliation, separation again. Multiple cycles of it, stretching across years. And every single time it was kept secret. Biographers described the entire arrangement as something that would have caused real, career-damaging scandal if it had ever leaked publicly. Which is precisely why almost no one outside their closest circle knew it was happening at all. Picture what that actually required of her. Pickford was, by the mid-1910s, arguably the single most photographed woman on the planet. Fan magazines tracked her schedule. Newspapers reported her every public appearance. And underneath all of that visibility, she was managing a private war that nobody covering her was even aware existed. A husband whose drinking worsened in direct, almost mathematical proportion to her own rising fame. She later wrote about this period herself, choosing her words with the same restraint that had defined her since childhood. She described Owen's behavior, on and off the set, as having caused her considerable pain. Mary Pickford did not reach for dramatic language easily. When even she, decades after the fact, in her own memoir, used a phrase like that, it tells you how much was sitting underneath it, deliberately understated. Meanwhile, the public version of her life ran on an entirely different track. Fan magazines printed soft-focus photographs of little Mary at home, framing her as the wholesome, dutiful screen ingenue America wanted her to be, sweet, modest, untouched by scandal. Studio publicity in this era depended on exactly that illusion. An actress's private unhappiness, let alone evidence of abuse, was not simply unflattering. It was a direct threat to the commercial value of the persona she had spent years building. So the unhappiness stayed hidden, by necessity, while the image kept selling. It is worth naming plainly what that arrangement actually demanded of her. Performing contentment for an audience of millions, while privately absorbing the consequences of a marriage that was, by multiple later accounts, becoming dangerous. In 1916, on a film set, she met Douglas Fairbanks. He had the same magnetism Owen Moore once had, but without the resentment underneath it. Fairbanks was already a major star in his own right. Hitch meant, unlike her husband, Pickford's success didn't threaten his sense of himself. If anything, it matched it. They began an affair sometime in the months that followed, both of them still legally married to other people, both of them keenly aware of exactly how much they stood to lose if any of it became public. For years, this became her second secret, layered directly on top of the first. Not only an unhappy, at times violent marriage hidden from public view, but now a forbidden relationship she could not act on without risking the entire career built on her wholesome public image. She later wrote that she and Fairbanks had to be extremely careful in how and where they met, because she was still legally bound to a man whose conduct had already caused her so much suffering, and any exposure could be disastrous for both of their careers. They met quietly, at the homes of trusted friends, slowly building toward a plan that could actually get her free. But a plan is not freedom. Pickford had been raised Catholic, and her devotion to her faith's teaching on the permanence of marriage is cited by historians as the central reason she stayed in an abusive relationship as long as she did. Leaving wasn't simply a personal decision in her mind, it was framed, by everything she had been taught since childhood, as a moral failure with consequences that outlasted any one unhappy marriage. So she stayed. Not because nothing was wrong, because everything she had ever been told about marriage warned her that leaving would be its own kind of disgrace. More public, more permanent, than anything happening behind closed doors at home. It eventually took an ultimatum from Douglas Fairbanks: divorce and marry him or lose him entirely, before she finally let herself choose differently. Even then, the calculation was not simple. Pickford was, by 1919 and 1920, not just an actress but a businesswoman with an enormous financial empire built almost entirely on a carefully managed at public image. A divorce scandal handled badly could have unraveled years of work overnight, work that supported not just her own household, but her mother, her siblings, and, by extension, an entire studio system that had come to depend on little Mary, remaining exactly the wholesome figure audiences believed her to be. Every decision she made about leaving Owen Moore had to be weighed against the financial and professional structure she had spent over a decade building, almost entirely on her own. That is the quiet, often overlooked truth sitting underneath the romantic version of this story. Mary Pickford did not simply fall in love and leave. She calculated, for years, exactly how much truth she could survive telling, and when. By 1920, Mary Pickford was no longer simply a movie star. A year earlier, she had co-founded United Artists alongside Fairbanks, Charlie Chaplin, and D.W. Griffith, a company built specifically to give filmmakers control over their own work, free of the distributors who had been taking the largest share of the profits. She later described the feeling that came with that independence in a single word: freedom. "It's a heady wine," she admitted. "And having tasted it, you find it impossible to go back to working for someone else." That same hunger for control over her own life extended, quietly, into the divorce. Pickford did not navigate the legal maneuvering alone. Her closest friend, screenwriter Frances Marion, was among the small circle who knew the real shape of what she'd endured with Owen Moore. One of the few people trusted with both the truth of the marriage and the plan to escape it. Years later, it would be Marion's recollections, alongside those of Fairbanks's own brother, that helped biographers piece together what actually happened behind the scenes of the divorce. And yet, to end her marriage, the most powerful woman in American film still needed a judge's signature. And because she did not have the 6 months requie read for Nevada residency, she needed a workaround. So she put on a disguise: a rough topcoat, plain winter hat, an unremarkable skirt, plain black shoes, tinted goggles, specifically chosen so that no one would recognize the face underneath them. She walked into the Douglas County District Court in Minden, Nevada, under the name on her legal documents, Gladys Marie Moore, and sat down in front of Judge F.P. Langan, who had no idea who she actually was. What happened next is documented. Between sobs, she swore she had moved to Nevada to regain her health and intended to make the state her permanent home. Then she told him the rest: that her husband had abandoned her on several occasions, with a final separation in April of 1917, that he had been verbally abusive, that he was frequently under the influence of liquor. Two things were happening in that courtroom simultaneously, and it's worth separating them clearly. The residency claim was fabricated, a legal maneuver designed to exploit Nevada's unusually liberal divorce laws, arranged with the help of political operator Pat McCarran, who was present in the room that day as part of the plan. Historian Guy Rocha later said bluntly that she should have won an award for her performance. He called it exactly what it legally was: perjury. But the abuse, the abandonment, the drinking, the years of fear underneath it was not invented. None of that was acting. She had simply waited 9 years and traveled 2,000 miles, in a disguise, for the chance to say it out loud in the one room where a stranger actually had the legal power to do something about it. Langan granted the divorce on the spot. She did not stay to feel relieved. A day later, she was on a train to Oakland. 25 days after that, she married Douglas Fairbanks. Here is the part most retellings skip entirely, because it complicates the fairy tale. Owen Moore did not simply vanish once the gavel came down. According to Scott Amon's biography of Pickford, drawing on the recollections of Fairbanks's brother Robert and Pickford's closest friend, screenwriter Frances Marion, Mary paid Owen a settlement to secure his cooperation with the divorce, a figure Amon places at roughly $100,000. Contemporary press accounts from the period placed the number dramatically higher. One 1920 newspaper report claimed it reached as much as $1 million. Sit with the contradiction in that for a second. The same woman who had just testified, under oath, that this man abandoned and abused her, was also the woman who had to pay him for the privilege of leaving him. Her freedom was not free. It was negotiated, itemized, financed entirely from her own earnings, because in 1920, a famous, wealthy woman still needed her own abuser's signature before she could legally walk away. There was no public reckoning waiting for Owen Moore on the other side of that courtroom. No headline asking what, exactly, had driven the most beloved actress in America to disguise herself and travel across the country just to escape him. The story the public actually consumed was a fairy tale. America's sweetheart finds her real-life leading man. The testimony underneath that fairy tale, the years it took to survive long enough to give it, simply disappeared from the version everyone preferred. That is its own quiet kind of silencing. Not a courtroom forcing her into secrecy. A public that liked the romance more than it wanted the truth. So the truth got buried under better headlines. Newspapers in March of 1920 ran the divorce as a brief procedural item, then devoted vastly more column space, 25 days later, to the wedding photographs from her marriage to Fairbanks. The arithmetic of public attention had already made its choice. Owen Moore's career, already fading before the divorce, never regained its earlier momentum. He kept working through the 1920s, but never again at the level he'd once held. Whatever judgment should have followed him for what happened in that marriage never really arrived. The world simply turned the page to the next chapter of Mary Pickford's life and left him behind it, almost entirely unexamined. For 13 years, the marriage to Fairbanks gave her something genuinely new: partnership instead of fear. Together they became the first true global celebrity couple, their Beverly Hills estate, Pickford, operating almost like a private royal court. Visiting heads of state would tour the White House, then specifically request a stop at Pickford. Guests over the years included Albert Einstein, Helen Keller, H.G. Wells, Amelia Earhart, and Lord Mountbatten. In 1926, when Pickford and Fairbanks traveled to the Soviet Union, hundreds of thousands of people reportedly lined the streets of Moscow just to see them pass. But the foundation underneath that glittering decade was never as stable as the estate's stone walls suggested. Pickford's own film career did not slow down during this period. If anything, it accelerated. Pollyanna in 1920 and Little Lord Fauntleroy in 1922 were enormous box office successes, and the hits kept coming. Rosita in 1923, Little Annie Rooney in 1925, Sparrows in 1926, My Best Girl in 1927. She had graduated, in the language of the fan press, from America's Sweetheart to World's Sweetheart, a title that came with no reel-off switch. The public wanted Little Mary, the same wholesome girl she'd been playing for over a decade, and there was little appetite, commercially, for her to grow up on screen the way she had already been forced to grow up in life. Her mother, Charlotte, her closest advisor and protector since childhood, died of breast cancer in March of 1928. Pickford was devastated and unable to find comfort in the Catholic faith she'd been raised in. She turned instead to Christian Science, eventually writing her own book on the subject, Why Not Try God? Published in 1934. Within a few years, both of her younger siblings, NGS, were dead. Lottie and Jack, the brother and sister she had effectively supported since she was a child herself, both died of alcohol-related causes. The same affliction that had defined her first marriage had now taken the two people she'd spent her entire childhood protecting. At the same time, the medium that built her empire was disappearing under her feet. Sound film arrived almost overnight, and Pickford's particular brand of stardom, built entirely on the visual glamour of silent pictures, did not survive the transition the way some of her peers' careers did. She made her 194th and final film, Secrets, in 1933, and retired from the screen. The combination hit all at once. Her mother's death, her siblings' deaths, the end of the silent era, and finally the end of her marriage. She and Fairbanks divorced in 1933. Biographers and documentary sources describe her in this period as deeply depressed. Not a single blow, but a cascade of losses arriving with almost no space between them. There would not be a third fairy tale waiting. She did marry once more, in 1937, to actor and bandleader Charles "Buddy" Rogers, and the couple adopted two children, Roxanne and Ronald. But by her own children's later accounts, the relationship was strained. Both later said their mother was too consumed by her own pain to offer them real warmth. Her son Ronald, recalling their relationship decades afterward, put it simply, "Things didn't work out that much, you know? But I'll never forget her. I think that she was a good woman. It would be easy to assume that, Having survived one marriage built on fear and another built on grief, Mary Pickford finally found peace in motherhood. The record does not support that assumption. According to the PBS American Experience documentary on her life, Pickford's relationship with Roxanne and Ronald grew increasingly tense as they moved into adolescence. She was, by multiple accounts, openly critical of their physical appearance, fixating, reportedly, on Ronald's small stature and Roxanne's crooked teeth, the kind of criticism that leaves a mark long after the comment itself is forgotten. Both children later said, as adults, that their mother had simply been too self-absorbed by then to offer them the kind of love a child actually needs. It is difficult not to notice the shape this makes across her whole life. A woman who had spent her own childhood being used, for income, for stability, for her family's survival, went on, by her own children's account, to struggle to give the one thing she had never been given herself: attention that wasn't conditional on usefulness. Both Roxanne and Ronald married young and left Pickford as soon as they were able to, putting distance between themselves and the increasingly isolated woman at its center. By the time her son spoke publicly about her, decades later, there was no bitterness left in his voice. Only the plain, unresolved sadness of someone describing a relationship that simply never became what it should have been. This is the detail that turns the story from tragic into almost unbearable. The woman who had testified, under oath, that her first husband's drinking had destroyed her private life eventually became an alcoholic herself. After retiring from film, as depression and grief compounded across the 1930s and 1940s, Pickford's own drinking slowly worsened. The same affliction that had taken her father, and then both of her siblings, now closing in on her as well. It is one of the most quietly devastating threads in the entire story. A woman who spent 9 years of her young life enduring a husband's alcoholism, who finally summoned the courage to name it out loud in a courtroom, ultimately found herself inheriting the very thing she had fled. There is no record of her ever publicly connecting those two facts: the husband she divorced for drinking, and the drinking she could not, in the end, escape herself. But the parallel sits in the historical record, regardless, undeniable once you know to look for it. Alcoholism took her father, both of her siblings, defined the marriage that nearly broke her in her 20s, and eventually became part of her own private struggle in the decades that followed. The pattern that had shaped almost every relationship of her childhood and young adulthood did not skip her. By the time she appeared in court again in 1959, this time over a business matter involving her co-ownership of a North Carolina television station, observers noted she still had her old sense of timing. The court date happened to fall on her 67th birthday. Asked under oath to state her age, she reportedly answered, "I'm 21, going on 20. It got a laugh in the room. It was also, in hindsight, a woman performing brightness in public for what may have been one of the last times anyone outside her closest circle would see her do it." Douglas Fairbanks died in 1939, 6 years after their divorce. By multiple accounts, he remained, in some sense, the love of her life. His death is described by biographers as the point at which Pickford truly began to withdraw, gradually becoming a recluse, remaining almost entirely inside Pickford, and limiting visits to a small, trusted circle. Her close friend, actress Lillian Gish, her former stepson, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and a handful of others. The withdrawal did not happen all at once. Crept forward across decades. By the late 1950s, she was staying almost entirely at Pickford, receiving only a select group of visitors. By the mid-1960s, she had reduced even that, often greeting people only by telephone, speaking to them from her own bedroom rather than appearing in person at all. Even her business obligations were not enough to draw her fully back into public view. In 1953, she and Chaplin, by then the only two surviving founders of United Artists, sold their shares in the company for $3 million each, closing out the chapter of her career that had once represented, in her own words, the freedom of controlling her own work. The transaction happened largely on paper. The woman behind it was, by then, rarely seen in person at all. By 1972, multiple accounts describe her as having become genuinely reclusive, rarely leaving Pickford for any reason. When the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences decided to award her an honorary Oscar in 1976, in recognition of a career that had helped invent the entire idea of a movie star, she was too frail and too unwilling to be seen to attend the ceremony in person. Instead, A film crew was sent out to Pickford to tape her message of thanks inside the house she rarely left. Audiences who watched the broadcast were reportedly stunned by how much she had visibly aged since they had last seen her, decades earlier, as the most photographed woman alive. She died 3 years later on May 29, 1979, in Santa Monica, California, following a cerebral hemorrhage. She was 87 years old. There is something almost impossible to sit with in the shape of that ending. The girl who supported her entire family by the age of 7. The teenager who married in secret at 17. The young wife who endured years of a husband's drinking and violence behind closed doors while smiling for cameras that never stopped finding her interesting. The 27-year-old who finally found the nerve to put on a disguise and tell a stranger, under oath, what had actually happened to her, only to watch the public quietly erase that testimony in favor of a more flattering story. That same woman spent her final decades largely behind a closed bedroom door, eventually speaking to the world through a telephone receiver instead of a face in the room. I have gone back through the Minden court accounts more than once, and what stays with me isn't the disguise or the legal maneuvering around residency. It's the plain, unadorned line about her husband being brutal and an alcoholic, spoken between sobs by a woman who had clearly been carrying it for years before anyone let her say it out loud. There is no surviving courtroom transcript that preserves Mary Pickford's Minden testimony word for word, in the way a modern televised trial would. What survives instead are the contemporaneous newspaper accounts, the records kept by the Douglas County District Court, and the later confirmation of state archivists who reviewed the case decades afterward. But the substance of it has never been seriously disputed, not by her biographers, not by the historians who have spent entire careers studying her life. A husband's drinking, a husband's brutality, conducted entirely out of public view. Years of enforced silence to protect a career and a public image that depended on the illusion of a happy marriage. A disguise worn into a courtroom because even her freedom had to be obtained quietly, carefully, hidden from the very public that claimed to adore her. And then, decades later, a different kind of disguise. Not goggles and a plain coat this time. A closed front door, an unanswered visitor's bell, a voice on a telephone instead of a face in a room. By the time of her death, her estate, anchored largely in the value of Pickford itself, the house she once filled with presidents, royalty, and Nobel laureates, was estimated in the tens of millions of dollars. The same house that had once hosted some of the most famous people on Earth became the place she eventually chose to disappear inside almost entirely. Today, she is remembered mostly for the curls, the smile, the title America's Sweetheart. Far fewer people remember the testimony in Minden, or the 9 years it took her to reach that witness stand, or the silence that swallowed her words again almost as soon as the wedding announcement made better headlines than the truth ever could. But the record is still there. The court still exists even though the building has changed. The words are still on file in Glass County, Nevada. A brutal husband, an alcoholic husband, a marriage she survived for 9 years before she was finally permitted, briefly, to say so out loud, to a stranger in a robe who had no idea who she was. She paid for her own freedom. She testified for it, in disguise, far from home. And then, for most of the rest of her long life, she lived largely behind a closed door. The same instinct toward concealment and self-protection that had once driven her to disguise herself to escape one husband, eventually closing in around her until there was almost no one left in the room at all. Her words remain on the record. They were true the day she spoke them, sobbing, in a courtroom that didn't recognize her face. It simply took the world far longer to listen than it took her to say them.